Dear all, my name is Grzegorz Jankowicz, and on behalf of Biuro Literackie, I conduct this set of conversations with writers whose books were chosen for this publishing series called New European Literary Canon. I ask these writers about their works. I ask about experiences behind the books. We also discuss our European identities. Sometimes we even try to envision the future of Europe and European forms of life. Today, my guest is Jan Škrob. Hello, Jan.
Hello.
This line appears in the poem called Geneva. The new reality is a culture of violence. In what sense does today's reality deserve this name, the culture of violence?
I think it's important to say that when I wrote the book, it was about 8 years ago when I started, 2015, 2016, 2017. The book got published in 2018 in the original. And it was a time of the huge refugee crisis in Europe. And what I perceived as violence primarily at the time was how European countries, and people in Europe in general responded to that crisis with rejection, basically, rejection of people who needed to escape war, who needed to escape extreme poverty and things like that. And that's one of the major themes behind the book, and it pains me to say actually that it didn't age at all, because nowadays we see it again in a way. Some things haven't changed at all. We still see the news about the refugees drowning in the Mediterranean Sea, or the reports of the situation on the border between Belarus and Poland, for example. And while we see a lot of solidarity also towards refugees from Ukraine, which is great, I think, it's also painful for me to see the contrast between how white refugees are treated as opposed to refugees from other parts of the world, or who don't fit the description of a European in this very wide and I dare say racist sense. So that's what I meant by violence. And of course, when we look around ourselves, we see a lot of violence happening in the world and in Europe also.
You create a kind of poetic geography in this book. In addition to the Geneva I mentioned a second ago, we have Dublin, we have Barcelona, or we have Trieste. Why exactly these cities? What are they for you?
There is a paradoxical concept behind that. At the time when I wrote those poems, I haven't visited any of those cities. And since then, since the book was published, I visited only one, that was Trieste. I've been to Trieste twice, but it was after I wrote that poem. But these cities nevertheless bring some associations to my mind, and that's why I chose them. Dublin, for example, is a city I chose because of the Dublin Treaty. That was an important thing at the time, also in regards to refugee crisis. There was limiting for the rights of refugees and so on. Geneva was, that was one of the important places of reformation in Europe. So that, in that case, it was the historical motif that was important for me, and so on. So I played with, I would say, mental images of those cities on purpose, And on purpose, I chose those I haven't seen with my own eyes, but with my mind, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. When I read your poems, Jan, I hear the diction of poets such as, for example, Whitman or Ginsberg, who with their texts, with their songs, wanted to steer the hearts of their contemporaries, awaken them from the slumber and make them change their forms of life. Is such a goal to steer the heart of the reader close to your poetic, to you as a poet, to you as someone creative, to you as someone who gives these texts, these poems to the audience?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that this is the reason why I write, the major reason. Of course, it's not political in the narrow sense, but politics is a part of it. But it's also a spiritual goal. It's very, very, very wide. And I think when we look at Whitman, who, by the way, is a huge influence on my poetry, and I have to confess that really I'm very fond of his work and his approach to poetry and life. I would say, yes, it's about awakening people to reality of life, which is not only violence and cruelty and, the dark aspects, which are also important to be aware of, but also it's joy and it's the knowing that everything is connected, and that is so there are the dark aspects that I talk about more often, I feel, but there's also the joy and beauty of life and the world, and I think that's equally important for us to actually care about the world in the end.
Numbers appear in the titles of several poems, and the notation of these numbers is somewhat reminiscent of the way football coaches are set up. Football coaches set up players on the field before the game, and the reference to soccer appears directly in your book. If this association is correct, which opponents do you conduct your poetic matches against?
It is on purpose, and one of the reasons is the very name of the book. Real has many meanings in Czech, and it can mean a lot of things, but also it associates one of the most famous football clubs, Real Madrid. And it's also one of the reasons, one of the poems in the book is called Barcelona, as you asked before. So it's kind of these playful metaphors around football. But for me, this metaphor itself wasn't about opponents, about oppositions. I would say that in the book there are a lot of motifs and themes that are about conflict, but with my football metaphors, it was the exact opposite, to bring awareness of certain playfulness, of not taking everything absolutely seriously, and that in a way what we do, what we try to do in our lives, that it all has an aspect of a game, so we can be a little bit more playful, a little bit less serious, and maybe less anxious about it, because in the end it's also about having a good time, which maybe sounds banal, but I think in radical, when we work with radical idols, with radical poetry, in a way we often forget that, and one of the important aspects of life is also to have a good time while we have the time.
Every play, every game has its rules. Even if it's just for fun, there are rules to follow. What would be your rules in terms of poetic form? How do you come up with certain way of phrasing, certain poetic forms you choose for your works?
I would say what's crucial for me is rhythm. that's where I start. And then, for example, in these poems, in this book, what I tried to do in a way was to mimic the rhythm of how people actually speak, which doesn't have any rules at the first sight, but then you can notice some patterns, some regularities that are not so visible, but they are there. In every language they are different, of course. That's what makes every language unique also, because we have different rhythms of speaking. And even when we speak English, everybody can tell that it's not my native language, because my rhythm of speech is probably very Czech still, even though I try to hide it when I speak English, but it's there. And that's something I really tried to work with. And I would say another thing was, which is again maybe a paradox, what I tried to do was to really show that there is very little order in how we think and how we speak. We stop in the middle of a sentence and start over with something else. We get an idea that is not relevant to the topic at hand, and we start to speak about something else, and it all, it all mixes in a very chaotic and very complex mixture, and it's actually quite difficult to mimic this in a poem, because you can't just do it as chaos. It's also in a way a play that that has rules, but they are actually very difficult to identify. It's also about intuition, but I would say that there is always order to chaos, and there is always some chaos to order. So it's about balancing these aspects.
In your beautiful poem called Trieste, you describe a crisis that makes it very difficult to talk about our own identity, our purpose and path we should take. We are just lost because of this crisis. Can the poem only bear witness to such a crisis, or can it help us deal with it? Can we just take ourselves out of this difficult situation, reading a poem or writing a poem through poetry as a form of thinking, experiencing, and feeling?
That's a very difficult question, I think. But when I ask these questions, or when I pose these ideas, I don't really think about answers, because I think what matters is to ask these questions and to think about these things. And the answer can be very different for every one of us. And what I like is that I may have some answers in mind when I write a poem, and when you read it, you can come to very different conclusions, and somebody else will read the poem and will have a very different idea. And I like this kind of a dialogue I'm not even aware of, because I don't know what my readers think, but I know it happens in a way. But it's not my goal to present an answer. My goal is to... I wouldn't even say that it's my goal to make people think. My goal is to make people feel something, like, or maybe to think about what they feel. That would be maybe the most accurate.
In response to our question about the possibility of changing the world through literature, you wrote that a poet can say whatever she or they wants, and that the poet has boundless freedom. Is it really the case that the poet can say whatever they want? Is it really, this freedom is really something that you can use in every text you write as a poet?
Of course, there is with freedom there is always responsibility. But what I meant with this answer is that when I write an academic text, for example, or a journalistic text, which is both areas I have some experience with, you are very restricted, very restrained in what you can say, and when you say something you have to present proofs and citations, and really you have to do all this work that somebody before me also thought that, and all this complicated apparatus behind every single thought. And for me, what's liberating about poetry is I don't have to do this, because I don't have to be rational. And I think that's what matters the most to me, that most language we use and we meet in the world today is very rational, very rationalistic, and it has all these rules and the restrictions of what you can say, not in the political sense of what's allowed to say, but in this systemic sense of that it has to be reasonable, it has to be rational. And as a poet, I don't have to do that. I can be irrational, which doesn't mean to be irresponsible or, just making things up because I want to. No, it means that I don't have to use only the language of my brain. I can also use the language of my heart, the language of my body, and in this way, it's more truthful in my opinion than just brains communicating with each other. This is like a more complete reality of our existence.
Among other things, my work involves conducting reading workshops with inmates in prisons. And recently I spoke to a group of inmates about the poems of American author Philip Levine. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but it doesn't matter. The meeting was extremely inspiring, but one of the participants resented the poets for not directly pointing out a solution that others could use. His problem was that he needs a solution. There is a problem, there should be a solution, and he wants to read a poem to get it, to receive a straightforward message. What should be the response to such a charge? Or what would be your response to such a charge?
This is very interesting. It reminded me of a review of this book, actually, when it got published. And one of the points of criticism in that review was that I speak about a lot of problems, but I don't present any solutions. And I would say it's not up to poets to present solutions. We have a role. That role is different. That's it. We speak about reality as it is, which is paradoxical in a way, because there is a lot of fantasy, a lot of visions that have very little to do with reality at the first sight, at least in my poetry, but it's the case with many poets. But I think there are just other groups of people who are there to actually come up with solutions. We can inspire them, and I would say that's one of the things I also try to do, to inspire the solution makers. And I don't mean politicians in the institutional sense, but people in all, all different areas of life. We as poets and artists can inspire them to find the answers. And what I see as my position and my goal is more like asking the questions or showing things to people.
Yeah, thank you for this inspiring conversation, and see you at the festival.
Thank you very much.